Tires screamed against asphalt. A loud cry pierced the Boston afternoon at a busy intersection. A little girl, no older than 5, had broken free from her mother's hand and chased a red balloon into the street. Suddenly, a blur of black fur. A large black Labrador bolted into traffic. Thud! A delivery truck screeched, swerved, and crashed into a light pole, missing the child by inches. People gasped. The dog lay motionless, twitching slightly. From the sidewalk, a ragged man rushed to its side. "Bear! Bear! Stay with me!" he cried, trembling. The crowd stared. Some recognized them. It was the same homeless man and his dog who'd been thrown out of a grocery store days before. Above them, the city's traffic camera quietly recorded everything. Jake Ralston used to fix things for a living: rails, signals, power grids. He believed everything broken could be mended with the right tools and a bit of patience. It was a belief that held true for decades, at least until his own life began to fracture in ways no wrench or wire could repair. He lived in Quincy, Massachusetts, in a modest 2-bedroom house shaded by a weeping willow. His wife, Kara, was a school librarian. Their mornings were quiet and slow: coffee, crossword puzzles, classical radio murmuring in the background. Their only child, in a sense, was Marley, a golden retriever with a soul too big for its body. Marley greeted Jake at the door every evening, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. Jake loved working on the railway system. There was something calming about the methodical hum of a train engine, the click-clack of steel on steel. It grounded him. But life derailed one winter. It began with a nor'easter that battered Boston and flooded several subway tunnels. Jake, working late-night emergency shifts, didn't come home for nearly 3 days. Kara understood at first, but Marley didn't. The dog stopped eating, stopped playing. One night, Jake came home to find Marley lying on the kitchen floor, unmoving. Kara sat next to the body, her hand gently resting on Marley's chest, her eyes vacant. She didn't speak, and Jake, for once, didn't know what to fix. Marley's death opened a rift neither of them had the strength to cross. Kara left quietly a week later, her wedding ring placed on the windowsill like punctuation to a sentence never finished. Jake stayed. But the house no longer felt like home. The silence was too sharp, the emptiness too loud. Then came the layoffs. The Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority was restructuring. Jake, with 23 years of service but no seniority perks, was dismissed via email. No handshake, no explanation. Just a line that read, "We regret to inform you." He tried to fight it, applied for jobs, sent out dozens of resumes. But being a 50-something technician with outdated skills and a recent personal tragedy didn't make him a hot hire. Weeks turned into months. The savings dried up, utilities shut off, his pantry emptied like an hourglass. Eventually, the house went too. Jake remembered the day he stood on the curb with his last belongings shoved into a duffel bag, the willow tree behind him still waving as if saying goodbye. He didn't look back. He couldn't. At first, he thought it would be temporary, a week or 2 on couches, maybe a church shelter. But the couches never materialized, and the shelters were always full. He found an alley behind Back Bay Station, under a broken neon sign, and made it his new address. He wasn't alone there. Boston's forgotten lived in shadows all across the city. He kept to himself, avoiding trouble, surviving on cheap coffee, stale bread, and instinct. Nights were cold, mornings colder. Then one night, as sleet whispered against concrete, he heard a whimper, faint, almost like a squeaky hinge. He followed the sound to a discarded refrigerator box behind a dumpster. Inside was a puppy, thin, soaked, shaking. Its fur was matted, mostly black with a white streak across its chest. Its back leg was wounded, wrapped clumsily with a shoelace and a fast food napkin. Jake stared. He should have walked away. But the pup looked up at him, blinking through rain. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It just looked hopeful. He crouched and muttered, "You don't know me, kid. I mess things up." The pup crawled forward and pressed its nose against Jake's fingers. That night, Jake shared his sandwich, half a crust, and cradled the animal under his coat. The pup's body trembled the whole time, but never moved away. He named it Bear, a joke, really. It was the smallest dog he'd ever seen, but Bear had a growl that could have scared a mountain lion. In the weeks that followed, Jake found purpose again. He begged for antiseptic from a clinic, tore strips from his last clean shirt to make proper bandages, snuck Bear into gas station bathrooms to wash its leg. When he could, he bought real dog food instead of scraps. Bear healed. Jake didn't, but he began to remember how to care again. Bear became more than a companion. He was warmth on freezing nights, protection from drunk strangers, and an unspoken reason to keep going. Jake stopped drinking. Not because someone told him to, but because Bear needed him alert. Together they became a fixture of the city. Jake taught Bear tricks to earn change. Sit, spin, paw. Sometimes they made enough for breakfast sandwiches, sometimes just enough for tap water. People would watch. Some laughed, some shook their heads. Most looked past them like they weren't there. But Bear didn't care, and neither, increasingly, did Jake. They had a rhythm. Not a life exactly, but a pattern. And when you've lost everything, even a pattern can feel like hope. Jake often talked to Bear the way he never could to people. "You didn't save me from the streets," he'd whisper at night. "You saved me from disappearing." Bear would blink, yawn, and nestle closer. It was enough. Until one day, everything shifted again. The cold that day wasn't the kind that bit sharply. It seeped in slowly, the kind of chill that made your bones feel hollow. Jake tugged the frayed straps of Bear's harness and crossed the street toward the grocery store on Tremont Avenue. A familiar place, but not a friendly one. The sidewalk was crowded with shoppers clutching reusable bags, their breath visible in the air, their eyes too preoccupied to notice a man and his dog standing quietly near the entrance. Jake positioned himself and Bear just to the side of the automatic doors, far enough not to be in the way, but close enough to feel part of the world. Bear sat, tail tucked neatly, alert but calm. Jake cupped his hands over his mouth and blew warm breath into them. They didn't beg. Jake never held a sign, never approached anyone. He just waited. Sometimes, when Bear did a trick, a polite bow, a slow spin, people smiled and a few dropped coins or food into Jake's battered coffee cup. Today started the same. A teenage boy with shaggy hair tossed them a half-eaten bagel and gave Bear a fist bump. An older woman handed Jake $1 without meeting his eyes. A kind-looking college student offered Bear a rice cracker. But then the rhythm broke. The store's manager, broad, bald, and forever angry, stormed through the automatic doors. His walkie-talkie bounced on his belt, and his eyes locked on Jake like heat-seeking radar. "You again," he said, voice full of contempt. "I thought we told you not to loiter here." Jake looked up calmly. "I'm not blocking the entrance. We're not causing any trouble." "You're scaring customers. The dog, he growled at someone last week." "That never happened," Jake replied, his tone low but firm. "Bear doesn't growl unless someone threatens us." The manager's nostrils flared. "I'm not going to argue. Leave, or I'm calling animal control and the police." Bear, sensing tension, stood and placed himself between Jake and the man. His posture was not aggressive, just protective. Still, the manager flinched. "See?" he barked. "Aggressive!" Jake gently laid a hand on Bear's back. "Easy, boy." The commotion began to draw stares. A few passers-by slowed their steps. A teenage girl nearby lifted her phone. Maybe filming, maybe texting. An elderly man mumbled, "They're not hurting anyone," but didn't intervene. Jake's face flushed with heat, not just from embarrassment, but from frustration. This was a scene he'd lived before. The routine of being pushed, judged, ejected because of how he looked, where he sat, who he had beside him. He stood slowly and said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke of a dignity the manager wouldn't understand. "Come on, Bear," he murmured, turning toward the sidewalk. They walked away with heads bowed, not in shame, but in resignation. They had been erased again. As they rounded the corner into the livery alley behind the store, Jake muttered, "I didn't ask for charity. Just a little space." Bear brushed his leg, offering silent comfort. Jake sat on a loading dock near a stack of wooden pallets, the smell of old onions and damp cardboard in the air. The noise of the city buzzed in the background, delivery trucks, traffic lights, distant sirens. The alley was darker here, more private. Bear laid his head on Jake's lap, sighing through his nose. "I know, buddy," Jake whispered, rubbing behind his ears. "We'll move on soon." A few minutes passed in tired silence. Then came a sound, small feet on concrete. Jake looked up. A young girl in a red coat stood a few feet away, holding a juice box and a cookie. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with wide blue eyes and messy pigtails. Her gaze went straight to Bear. "Can I pet him?" she asked softly. Jake glanced behind her. No adult in sight. "He's gentle," Jake said, "but only if he comes to you." Bear rose slowly, sniffed the air, and padded forward. The girl crouched. Bear nudged her hand and licked her fingers. She giggled. "He's so soft." Jake smiled faintly. "He likes kids. What's his name?" "Bear." "Like a real bear?" "Not quite as scary." She looked up at Jake, curious. "Why are you sitting back here?" He hesitated, then replied, "Because not everyone likes seeing people like me out front." Before she could answer, a shrill voice rang out from the alley entrance. "Sophie! What do you think you're doing?" A woman came storming around the corner, tall, dressed in a wool coat, clutching her purse tightly. When she saw Jake, her face twisted into panic and disgust. "Get away from him!" she screamed, pulling the girl back. "Don't touch that dog. Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" Sophie tried to explain. "Mom, he's nice. His name is—" "I said no." Jake raised his hands. "She's fine, ma'am. Bear's trained. We weren't— I don't care what he is. Stay away from children." With that, she dragged Sophie by the arm and stormed out of the alley. Sophie looked over her shoulder, eyes full of apology. Bear sat down beside Jake, confused. Jake sighed, shoulders sagging again. "She was kind," he said aloud. "More than her mom." He reached into his coat and found the rice cracker the college student had given him, broke it in half, offered a piece to Bear. "You did good, buddy." That night, they found a dry spot under the awning of a closed bookstore, near the edge of Chinatown. Jake curled beside Bear, sharing a thin blanket, watching the glow of the city blur behind tears he refused to shed. "She didn't see a stray," he murmured. "She saw you." Bear didn't move, just breathed, slow and steady, into Jake's chest. The day started with a stillness that didn't feel right. The city stirred slowly beneath a pale sky, clouds thick and unmoving like cotton stretched too thin. Jake stirred beneath the awning of the closed bookstore, brushing condensation from his coat, then gently from Bear's fur. The dog blinked at him, yawned and licked Jake's knuckles as if to say, "Still here, still with you." They hadn't slept much. The night had been restless, full of dreams. Jake couldn't remember, but woke from sweating. Something heavy hung in the air that morning. Not fear, exactly, but tension, like the world holding its breath. Jake tucked the worn blanket into his backpack, shouldered it, and gave Bear's head a rub. "Let's find some sun, huh?" They walked through downtown, past shuttered shops and delivery vans unloading crates of produce. Bear limped slightly. His old injury from the streets still flared on colder days, but he kept pace. When they reached Tremont Street again, Jake paused. It wasn't deliberate. They hadn't planned to return. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe habit. Or maybe Jake just wanted to prove to himself that yesterday's humiliation wouldn't haunt him forever. Instead of approaching the grocery store, Jake crossed the street and settled on a low concrete planter across from the entrance. Bear sat beside him, tail curled neatly, his eyes scanning the passers-by like a sentinel. They sat in silence. The morning rush was picking up. Families hurried past, arms full of groceries. Students in sweatshirts carried coffee and bagels. Jake rested his hands in his lap. Bear rested his chin on Jake's shoe. Then a flash of colour caught Jake's eye. A red coat, bright as a cardinal in snow. It was the girl, Sophie. She stood at the corner beside her mother, holding a balloon string tightly in one hand. Her mother, tall, anxious, still scrolling through her phone, was not paying attention. Sophie's eyes lit up when she spotted Bear. She pointed. Bear's ears twitched. His tail gave a slow wag. Jake offered her a small smile and a nod, but didn't move. He didn't want to provoke another confrontation. Sophie waved shyly, and then the string slipped. The red balloon jerked upward, caught a gust of wind, and danced out of her hand. Sophie gasped. "My balloon!" Before her mother could react, Sophie tore free and ran into the street after it. The balloon floated just ahead of her, bumping along with the breeze. Jake stood up so fast his vision swam. "Sophie!" her mother screamed. A chorus of voices echoed behind her. The light was still green. A delivery truck was rounding the corner, going faster than it should have. Jake bolted into the crosswalk, but Bear moved first. In one fluid motion, Bear lunged forward, leash snapping free from Jake's grip. He sprinted directly into the street. Time snapped in half. Sophie reached the balloon in the middle of the lane just as the truck bore down. The driver slammed on the brakes, horn blaring, tires skidding. Bear jumped. He hit Sophie from the side, not hard enough to hurt her, but enough to knock her out of the truck's path. The little girl rolled to the side of the road, scraped but safe. Bear wasn't so lucky. The truck's bumper clipped him mid-air. sending his body tumbling across the asphalt. The balloon popped. Jake reached Sophie first. "Are you okay? You're okay, you're okay." He checked her arms, her head blinking through panic. "I think so," Sophie sobbed. "Where's the dog? Where's Bear?" Jake turned, and everything inside him froze. Bear was lying on the pavement, motionless, one hind leg twisted unnaturally, his chest heaving in shallow bursts. Jake ran to him, collapsed to his knees. "Bear! Bear, look at me, hey buddy, come on." His hands hovered helplessly. He didn't want to move him, afraid he'd make it worse. Blood trickled from Bear's mouth, but his eyes fluttered, searching for Jake's face. "I'm here," Jake whispered. "I've got you. You saved her, Bear. You did it." People surrounded them now, a growing circle, phones out, faces stunned. "He saved that kid's life," someone said. "I saw the whole thing." "Where's the mom?" Sophie ran to Bear's side despite her mother's protests. She knelt beside Jake, her tears streaking down her cheeks. "Is he going to die?" she asked. Jake blinked hard. "Not today," he said. "Not today, kiddo." A siren wailed nearby. Someone had called 911. An ambulance pulled up and EMTs jumped out, scattering the crowd. "He's hurt," Jake said, voice hoarse. "Help him, please." "He's a dog," one medic started. "He's a hero," Jake snapped. "He took a truck for that little girl." The EMT looked at the child, at the dog, then at Jake. She nodded. "We'll take him." Jake refused to let go of Bear's paw as they loaded him into the back. "He rides with me," he said. The medic didn't argue. As the doors closed, Sophie reached out and squeezed Jake's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake couldn't speak. He just nodded, eyes full, Bear's blood on his jeans. It was just another Tuesday shift, or so Ellen Guyon thought. She sat hunched in a swivel chair deep inside Boston's traffic monitoring center, an unremarkable room filled with humming screens, half-empty coffee cups, and the faint scent of microwave popcorn. Her job was mostly routine, reviewing flagged footage, documenting traffic violations, and occasionally scrubbing through hours of mind-numbing red light data. But that morning, one alert stood out. Near-miss collision, Tremont and Charles, 11:14 a.m. Ella clicked the feed out of habit, expecting a jaywalker darting across lanes or someone cycling through a red light. What she saw made her freeze. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A little girl chasing a red balloon, a truck approaching too fast from the corner, then a streak of black fur, a dog, leaping, slamming into the child. The balloon popped, the truck skidded sideways. Ella's mouth went dry. She rewound the footage and watched it again. Then in slow motion, frame by frame. A man rushed into the frame seconds later, unkempt, ragged, but his face was unmistakable. Grief, terror, and love all contorted into a silent scream as he knelt beside the fallen dog. "Jesus," Ella muttered, "that dog saved her." Protocol dictated she flag the footage, archive it, and notify the supervisor. But Ella's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Something in her chest said this was different. This wasn't just a traffic report. It was a miracle, and people needed to see it. She exported the clip, edited out unnecessary timestamps, and uploaded it to a private drive. Then, without attaching her name, she emailed it to 3 local news stations with a single line. "You'll want this on air tonight. Trust me." She expected nothing. 20 minutes later, it was viral. The first broadcast came from Channel 6. By the time the 5 o'clock news aired, the clip had already been shared 20,000 times across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The internet branded him instantly. Bear the hero dog, homeless angel Boston miracle. It wasn't just a video, it was a narrative, one that people clung to like a rope in dark water. The story hit all the right emotional notes. A child saved, a dog's selfless leap, a man society had discarded stepping into the spotlight not for what he lacked, but for what he gave. But amid the love, questions multiplied. Who was the man? What happened to the dog? Where were they now? Jake, meanwhile, sat numb in the corner of the veterinary trauma ward. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him. His hoodie was soaked through from the ambulance ride, his hands stained with Bear's blood. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. Nurses tried to reassure him, but their words blurred into static. He stared at the closed double doors that led into surgery. Somewhere beyond them, Bear was fighting to live. A tech had offered to clean his clothes, even bring him coffee. But Jake just shook his head. His world had shrunk to a single corridor. Then the door opened, and everything changed. A woman in a sharp blazer, camera crew in tow, stepped into the waiting room. She looked out of breath and starstruck. "Are you Jake Ralston?" Jake stiffened. "Yeah, why?" "We've been trying to find you all day. That footage, it's all over the internet. Your dog saved that little girl. The whole country is talking about it. Everyone wants to know who you are." Jake blinked, uncomprehending. "Footage?" The woman showed him her phone. The video played on loop, Bear sprinting, leaping, crashing into the girl, then lying still. Jake's hand trembled. "They caught that on camera?" "You and Bear are heroes," she said softly. "Would you be willing to talk to us? People want to help." Before he could answer, the vet emerged. She looked exhausted, but she smiled. "He made it through surgery," she said. "It'll be a long recovery. He'll need pins in his leg, rest, therapy, but he's alive." Jake covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook, not from sadness this time, but something raw. Relief. Later that night, Jake sat in a borrowed blazer under the lights of a makeshift interview room inside the hospital. His hands still fidgeted, unused to attention. Bear lay nearby, heavily sedated but stable, wrapped in clean white bandages, an IV trailing gently from his paw. The reporter asked him to tell his story. He hesitated, then began, not with the rescue, but with the alley where he first found Bear. The hunger, the cold, the shoelace he used to tie Bear's leg when no one else would. The nights he'd nearly given up before that small black-furred creature nudged him back into trying again. "He saved me first," Jake said quietly. "Long before today. He gave me someone to stay alive for, and now he gave everything for someone else's child." The camera operator wiped away tears. The interview aired that same evening. Within hours, donations flooded in, some for Bear's medical care, some for Jake himself. Messages poured in from across the country. People offered him a place to live, a job, a second chance. Jake Ralston had always been used to disappearing. Over the years, he'd perfected the art of stepping around crowds, keeping his eyes low, his movements quiet. Being ignored wasn't new. In fact, it was comfortable, predictable. But now, sitting stiffly on a borrowed cot in the corner of the animal hospital, his name was everywhere. It was printed in bold on newspapers left at the front desk. It was scrolling across TV screens in the waiting room. Strangers spoke it with admiration, with reverence, like he was someone they'd always known. Jake Ralston, the man behind the hero dog. He didn't know how to carry that. Bear was still resting in the ICU behind glass doors, his legs suspended by pins and tape, his chest rising in gentle, steady rhythm. A red cast wrapped around his hind limb, covered in signatures and tiny hearts drawn by kids who had visited just to say thank you. Jake sat there every hour they let him. When the nurses asked if he needed anything, he said no. When they offered food, clothes, a room in the nearby shelter, he mumbled thanks and returned to Bear's side. All he wanted, truly wanted, was for his friend to pull through, and Bear was fighting. Quietly, stubbornly, like always. The next morning, a woman from a non-profit entered the waiting room holding a tablet and a thick file folder. Her name was Lynn. Mid-30s, ponytail, sharp eyes softened by compassion. She introduced herself as someone representing a growing number of very inspired people. She pulled up the donation page. "You've had over $92,000 in contributions in less than 36 hours, she said, scrolling. "And it's climbing every minute. Messages, offers of help, interviews. This, what you and Bear did, people care." Jake rubbed his face with both hands. "Why?" "Because you didn't have to do anything, and you did everything." He looked at her like she was speaking a language he barely remembered. Lynn smiled gently. "We've already secured a temporary apartment for you, rent-free for 6 months. If you're ready, we'll have a car bring you there this week. Furnished, safe, no strings attached." Jake blinked at her, then glanced at Bear through the window. "I'm not leaving him." "You won't have to," she said quickly. "He's coming with you, when he's strong enough. Until then, we've arranged for you to stay right here." Jake sat back, dazed. "I don't know how to live like that anymore." "Then we'll teach you," she said. "You just focus on healing, him and yourself." That afternoon, Jake got his first taste of life outside the shadows. A Channel 9 news crew arrived. Jake had been reluctant, but Lynn encouraged him to speak. "Tell your story," she said. Not for sympathy, for dignity. So he did. He sat in front of the camera, a little stiff in the shoulders, his worn denim jacket draped over new, donated clothes. The interviewer asked about Bear, the rescue, the years on the streets, but Jake talked about something else. He talked about Marley, his first dog, the one who died when his marriage fell apart. He talked about losing his job, how fast the floor beneath you could vanish. He talked about Bear showing up in a box behind a dumpster, half dead, and choosing him without hesitation. And then he talked about the red balloon, about Sophie, about that moment when instinct took over and love outran logic. "I didn't tell Bear to do it," he said, voice low. He just knew. That girl needed saving, and he didn't think twice. He never does. The segment aired that night, and it changed everything. Donations doubled. People offered Jake full-time jobs, even college scholarships. Artists painted murals of Bear. Local kids wrote letters in crayon. "You are a hero. Thank you, Bear. Come to my school." For Jake, it was surreal. He walked outside that evening for the first time since the incident, and strangers waved at him. A man gave him a scarf. A teenager shyly asked for a selfie, but Jake still felt unsure, out of place. That changed when Sophie and her mother visited the hospital the next day. She wore the same red coat, though now it had a small tear at the sleeve. She carried a plastic folder with drawings inside, one of her Bear and Jake in front of the grocery store under a big smiling sun. Jake's voice caught when he saw it. Her mother stepped forward and extended her hand. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "You saved my daughter." Jake shook her hand gently. "He did, not me." "No," she said. "You raised him. You protected him. He learned it from you." Sophie gently touched Bear's ear as he slept, whispering, "He's my hero." Jake sat in stunned silence, not invisible, not unwanted, not today. That night, after everyone left, Jake sat beside Bear's kennel. The city hummed softly beyond the windows. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the world was moving on without him. He read a letter out loud, one from a man in Florida who had seen the news. "I lost everything 2 years ago. Watching you made me believe I can rebuild too. Thank you for reminding me I still matter." Jake folded the letter and wiped his eyes. He whispered, "You hear that, Bear? We're doing something right." Bear opened one eye, gave a slow blink, and fell back asleep. Jake had faced many kinds of silence in his life. The echoing silence after losing a job, the numb silence when Marley died, the biting silence of being turned away without a word. But this silence was different. It was the moment before the curtain opens, before the crowd breathes in unison, expectant, curious, open. He stood just outside the gymnasium of Oak Ridge Elementary, gripping Bear's leash with one hand and a folded piece of notebook paper with the other. The leash felt familiar, grounding. The paper, not so much. On it were a few scribbled lines he had tried to prepare. A speech, Lynn had called it. He was pretty sure it was just nervous rambling. Inside the gym, the voices of dozens of children blended into a rising hum. Posters hung from every wall, scrawled in crayon and glitter. "Welcome, Bear and Jake. Real heroes. Thank you for being brave." A giant drawing of a black dog with angel wings stood proudly at the front of the room, paws outstretched like a guardian. Jake tugged at the collar of his donated sweater. He still wasn't used to clothes that fit, or being invited indoors. Bear, now walking better though, still favouring one leg, stood beside him with quiet dignity. His fur had begun to grow back where they had shaved him for surgery. His cast had already been signed by half the hospital staff. "Ready to face the crowd, buddy?" Jake whispered. Bear looked up at him and gave a single wag of his tail. Principal Carver greeted them at the door, her face warm and welcoming. "They've been waiting all week," she said. "You'd think a movie star was coming." Jake chuckled nervously. "I think you oversold us." She smiled. "No, Jake, I don't think we did." They entered together, and the room erupted into applause. Jake froze. He hadn't expected that. Bear didn't even flinch, just sat down, composed as ever, head high. Children leaned forward from the bleachers, wide-eyed, some already waving. A few wore T-shirts with Bear's face on them, hand-drawn, uneven, perfect. Teachers lined the back, holding up phones to record. Somewhere near the front, Jake spotted a familiar face. Sophie, sitting with her class, grinning, holding a balloon tied to her wrist. Jake cleared his throat, stepped to the microphone and began. "Hi, I'm Jake, and this guy here is Bear." The gym cheered again. Bear barked once, soft, playful, which sent the kids into a fresh round of laughter. Jake smiled, nerves softening just a bit. "We weren't always people you'd invite to speak. In fact, there was a time not too long ago when most folks didn't even want to see us." He paused. "We didn't have a home, not even a proper bed, but we had each other. That's what kept us going." He glanced down at Bear, and then one day Bear saw someone else who needed help, and he ran. He didn't stop to ask why or wait for permission. He just acted. That's why we're here. A hand shot up from the crowd, then another. Principal Carver stepped forward. "They've prepared a few questions. Would you mind answering some?" Jake nodded, folding his speech paper in half. "Let's hear them." The questions came quickly. How did Bear learn to be so brave? Did you cry when he got hurt? What does he like to eat now that you're not homeless? Jake laughed. Chicken and peanut butter. The children laughed too. Then a quiet voice from the side asked, "Were you ever scared to ask for help?" Jake hesitated. "Yes," he said. "More scared than I was being outside in the snow, because asking meant admitting I needed something, and for a long time I thought I didn't deserve that." Silence again. "But you know what Bear taught me? That asking isn't weakness, it's trust, and sometimes the world surprises you." A boy in a wheelchair rolled closer. "You think Bear would want to visit us again?" Jake grinned. "I think Bear just made new friends for life." After the assembly, the children swarmed around Bear like he was royalty. He stood tall, tail wagging, accepting every pet, every scratch behind the ear like he knew it mattered. Jake sat on a bench outside the gym later, the autumn sun warming his back. Bear lay curled beside him, eyes half closed. Sophie approached, holding a small gift bag. "For Bear," she said. "There's a blanket in there. My grandma made it, and a squeaky chicken." Jake accepted it gently. "He's going to love that chicken." Sophie sat beside Bear, hugging him gently. "I'm glad you didn't disappear again," she said. Jake's voice was quiet. "Me too." That night, Jake returned to the modest apartment he now called home. The place wasn't large, just a studio with peeling paint and a humming fridge, but it was dry, warm, and his name was on the lease. He turned on the light, dropped his keys in a bowl, and found something on the floor just inside the door. An envelope. No name. No stamp. Inside was a folded piece of paper. One line written in sharp ink. "I know who you are, Jake Ralston, and it's time we talk." Jake's hands stiffened. He looked over at Bear, who had just flopped onto his bed near the radiator. Not all ghosts stay buried. Jake Ralston hadn't heard his real name said aloud in over a decade, not the way it was meant to sound, like a part of something he once belonged to. It had become a technicality, a footnote scribbled on the back of expired ID cards and forgotten job applications. But now, as he stood in his small apartment, holding a letter with no return address, it felt louder than ever. "I know who you are, Jake Ralston, and it's time we talk." He reread the sentence for the 5th time, lips pressing into a line. Bear lay on the floor nearby, chewing absently on the stuffed squeaky chicken that Sophie had given him. Jake watched the dog for a moment, then walked to the window, letter still in hand. Someone out there knew, and not the version of him that slept under train trestles or gave interviews in borrowed jackets. Someone knew the before, the man who'd worn a wedding ring, clocked in every morning, and once thought the worst thing that could happen was losing a dog. The city outside looked unchanged, but inside, something had shifted. 2 days passed. Jake tried to shake the feeling off, returning to the hospital for Bear's checkup, meeting with Lynn about managing donations, answering thank you cards from classrooms across the country. But the letter stayed on the counter, like it was waiting for him to stop pretending. And then, on the 3rd morning, someone knocked. Not hard, just 2 polite, deliberate raps. Jake opened the door slowly and forgot how to breathe. The man on the threshold was older now, more grey than brown in his hair, a cane in one hand, but the eyes were the same. Evan Miller, his former brother-in-law. Jake hadn't seen him since the wake after Marley died, back when Kara still wore her wedding ring, and Jake still wore guilt like a second skin. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Can I come in?" Evan finally asked. Jake stepped aside without a word. The silence inside the apartment was thicker than the one outside. Bear lifted his head from his bed, but didn't bark. He sniffed the air, recognizing Evan's scent somewhere deep in his memory. Then, with a grunt, he laid his head back down. Jake watched the exchange, then gestured toward the table. "You didn't answer my question. Why now?" Evan didn't sit. I saw you on the news. At first I thought, there's no way, but I watched again and again. Then I knew. It was you. Jake crossed his arms. So you tracked me down? I didn't have to, Evan said. Kara asked me to. Jake froze. The name hit him like a brick to the chest. She asked, Evan nodded, before she passed. The air vanished from Jake's lungs. She's gone? He asked, voice barely audible. Breast cancer. Diagnosed too late. She didn't tell anyone until there wasn't much time left. She passed 2 months ago. Jake sat down heavily. I didn't know, he said. She didn't want to reach out, Evan continued. Said you'd moved on. Said you deserved peace. But near the end, she changed her mind. She asked me to find you. She wanted you to have something. Evan opened his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, weathered at the edges. Her journal. Jake hesitated, then took it. The first page was dated 2 years ago. The handwriting was hers, elegant, curling letters like he remembered. Jake, if you ever read this, I want you to know that I never hated you. I was hurt. I was lost. But I always loved who you were when no one was watching. I just didn't know how to reach you after you stopped reaching for yourself. Jake stared at the words for a long time. Bear moved closer, resting his chin on Jake's knee. Evan sat down across from him. She never stopped wondering if you were okay. When the video of Bear went viral, she saw it before she passed. She told me, that's him. That's the man I married. Jake nodded slowly, emotion rising like a tide he couldn't stop. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I thought I wasn't worth staying for. Evan's voice was quieter now. Maybe you were both wrong, in different ways. Jake looked up. Why else are you here? Evan hesitated. Then he reached into his coat and handed Jake another envelope. This one was yellowed, addressed in shaky handwriting. Jake turned it over. That's from your father, Evan said. He's in a care facility upstate, stage 4 Parkinson's. But when I mentioned your name, he grabbed my hand and said, he's alive? That was the first full sentence he'd said in weeks. Jake stared at the envelope as if it might explode. My father walked out when I was 15. I know, Evan said gently, but he's asking now. If you want to go, I'll take you. Jake leaned back, the weight of it all pressing against his chest. Bear nudged his elbow, sensing the change. After a moment, Jake whispered, maybe it's time I stopped running. That night, Jake lay on the floor next to Bear's bed, Kara's journal open beside them. He read her words aloud, softly, to no one but his best friend. At one point, he stopped and said, do you think I can face him? Bear licked his palm. It was answer enough. The nurse had warned him. He might not remember your name right away, she'd said gently. Parkinson's comes and goes like the tide. But Jake didn't come all this way for clarity. He came because the silence had lasted too long. The care facility sat on the northern edge of a sleepy Massachusetts town, nestled between maple trees that hadn't yet surrendered their last yellow leaves. The air smelled of pine mulch and antiseptic, and somewhere deeper, memory. Jake walked slowly through the garden path, Bear at his side. The dog moved cautiously, his steps still uneven but improving. Jake hadn't brought the leash. Today wasn't about control, it was about presence. They reached the stone-paved courtyard in the back, where a man in a wheelchair sat with his head bent forward, slowly sketching lines into the dirt with the end of a broken pencil. Jake stopped. There he was, Thomas Ralston, his father. Older now, thinner but unmistakable. The strong jaw had softened, but the furrowed brow and tired eyes were exactly as Jake remembered them. Except now they looked like they had held 30 years of something unsaid. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped forward. Dad? The man didn't move. Jake tried again, softer. It's me. Jake. The pencil paused, his father's hand stilled. Then slowly, achingly, he turned his head. Their eyes met. Jake expected confusion, maybe even indifference, but what he saw instead wasn't forgetfulness. It was recognition, quiet and tentative, like an old lamp flickering back to life after a long blackout. A whisper, Jake? Jake nodded, lips pressed tight. Yeah, it's me. Thomas's hand trembled and the pencil dropped. Jake bent down and picked it up. I'm sorry it took me so long, Jake said. Thomas blinked slowly, his voice scratchy with disuse. Didn't think you'd want to. I didn't, Jake admitted, for a long time. A silence passed, not uncomfortable, just thick. Then Thomas motioned weakly toward the bench beside him. Jake sat. You left, Jake finally said. I was 15. You didn't call, didn't write. I waited, and then I stopped waiting. Thomas nodded slowly. Why? A breath, shaky. I thought I'd failed you, his father said. And your mother. I lost the house, the job. I couldn't fix it. And I thought, if I disappeared, maybe you'd have a better chance without me dragging you down. Jake blinked back, heat in his eyes. That's not how it works. You don't get to decide what someone needs. You just stay. Thomas looked down. I didn't know how. Bear stepped forward and pressed his head gently against the old man's hand. Thomas reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed through the dog's fur. His lips lifted into the faintest smile. Who's this? Jake exhaled. His name's Bear. He saved my life, more than once. Thomas nodded, still petting. He reminds me of Marley, he said. You used to walk him before school, always in the red hoodie. Jake chuckled softly. You remember that? I remember a lot, even if I don't always know what day it is anymore. They sat for a long time like that, two shadows that had finally turned to face one another. I watched the news, Thomas said suddenly. The girl, the truck, the dog. Jake looked up. I saw you standing on that sidewalk, and I realized you had become everything I hoped for, even after all I missed. Jake didn't speak. Thomas turned slowly, eyes misty. Can you forgive me? Jake let the silence sit. Then he nodded, voice hoarse. Yeah, I think I already did. I just didn't know it yet. They didn't talk about everything that day, not the details, not the missing years, but they didn't need to. The healing didn't come from answers. It came from showing up. Before he left, Jake bent down and hugged his father. Not hard, not long, but enough. Goodbye, Dad, he said. Thomas gripped his hand. Not goodbye, he whispered. Just later. Back at the apartment, Jake stood at the window with Bear by his side, watching the city blink awake with its usual rhythm, cars weaving through traffic, distant voices rising from the sidewalks below. He hadn't expected closure, but what he'd found was something quieter and maybe even more lasting. Connection, and a new sense of weight in the quiet. He looked down at Bear. We came back from the edges, huh? Bear gave him a lazy blink, then leaned his head against Jake's leg. There was a knock on the door. Jake opened it to find Lynn holding a neatly wrapped box and a letter. The mayor's office, she said. There's going to be a public ceremony next week. They want you and Bear to accept a civic medal for heroism. Jake blinked. Me? At a podium? Lynn laughed. There'll be kids, families, news crews. You up for it? Jake looked down at Bear. We've stood in worse places. City Hall Plaza buzzed with a quiet anticipation. Jake stood behind the side curtain of the main stage, fidgeting with the cuffs of a borrowed navy blue suit. The collar sat stiff against his neck, unfamiliar but oddly comforting. He hadn't worn anything like this in years, not since long before the streets became his shelter. Beside him, Bear sat proudly, his head high, a blue ribbon across his chest that read Community Hero. The dog was freshly groomed, his fur brushed until it gleamed like copper under the afternoon light. Dozens of eyes turned as the crowd shifted in their seats, waiting. You ready? Lynn asked gently, straightening Jake's tie one last time. He looked out across the plaza, families, police officers, reporters, children holding cardboard signs with crayon drawings of Bear, and then down at his dog. Yeah, he said. Let's do it. Moments later, the mayor stepped up to the microphone. A hush swept through the plaza like wind across tall grass. Today, we gather not just to recognize bravery, she began, her voice strong, but to honor quiet acts of humanity. This year's Civic Medal of Valor goes to two unlikely heroes, one man and one four-legged companion, whose story reminded us all of what it truly means to be seen, to be valued, and to act with compassion. Applause erupted. Jake stepped onto the stage, his hands at his sides. Bear walked beside him, calm and dignified. The mayor greeted them both with warm smiles. She placed a silver medal around Jake's neck, then leaned down to pin a miniature medal to Bear's vest. The applause grew louder. Phones flashed. A little girl in the front row yelled, "Go, Bear!" Jake chuckled softly, stepped up to the microphone and took a breath. I didn't think I'd be here, he said. Not because I didn't want to be, but because, for a long time, I didn't think anyone would notice me. The plaza grew silent. For years I walked this city's streets, slept under bridges, got told to move along, invisible to most. But this dog, he gestured to Bear. He didn't care if I was clean or well-spoken or had a place to live. He just stayed. Jake's voice steadied. Then one day he ran in front of a moving truck to save a little girl's life. No hesitation, no fear, just action. He reminded me that love doesn't care about where you've been, it only cares about where you're willing to go. He paused. I'm not a hero. I didn't expect a medal, but I do hope one thing, that you'll remember this moment the next time you see someone who looks lost or broken. Because under that dirt, under those layers, there's someone who still matters. Someone who could change your life. Silence. Then thunderous applause. Bear barked, once, clear and bold, and the crowd rose to their feet. After the ceremony, people approached from every direction. A teenager handed Jake a drawing of Bear with angel wings. A young woman in social services invited him to speak at a youth shelter. A local librarian asked if he'd be open to sharing his story in a citywide storytelling campaign. Jake was overwhelmed, but grateful. And then came a voice from behind. Jake Ralston? He turned to see an older man in a worn denim jacket, a faded train logo stitched over the left breast pocket. It's been a long time, the man said. Trevor, we worked Quincy Yard together. You helped me fix a jammed freight lock in '96. Jake squinted. Trevor Rowe? Trevor smiled. Didn't think I'd forget the guy who loaned me his last clean pair of gloves. They shook hands. I run a rail heritage project now, Trevor continued. We restore old lines, train apprentices. We need someone who knows the guts of the system and who's been through enough to teach more than just mechanics. Jake blinked. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to build something again. Jake looked down at Bear. The dog wagged once gently. Let's talk, Jake said. That evening, Jake walked along the Charles River with Bear trotting at his side. The medal on his chest clinked softly with each step. He passed people who smiled, nodded, waved. Some recognized him. Others just sensed the shift, the way he walked with his shoulders back, chin lifted. Not arrogant, but grounded. Not proud, but whole. Back in his small apartment, he opened a stack of mail Lynn had gathered from well-wishers. One envelope stood out, thick, cream-coloured, elegant. Inside, a letter from a New York publishing house. Mr. Ralston, we believe your story carries a rare kind of light, one that could guide others out of the dark. If you're willing, we would be honoured to publish your memoir. Emma Lynn, acquisitions editor. Jake stared at the letter, then looked at Bear. I think we're not done yet. Bear leaned against his leg and sighed. Jake sat at his small kitchen table, the glow of his laptop casting a soft light across the dark room. Outside, the Boston skyline shimmered under the night sky, but Jake's focus was on the blinking cursor in front of him. It pulsed patiently, like a heartbeat, waiting for his words. Bear lay at his feet, tail twitching now and then in his sleep. The ribbon from the ceremony still hung near the door, next to a leash and a worn-out tennis ball. Jake reached for the keyboard. My name is Jake Ralston. You might know me as the man who helped save a little girl from a truck. But that's not the story I want to tell. Not really. I want to tell you about the nights before that. The silence, the hunger, the people who looked away, and I want to tell you about the dog who refused to. He paused, reread the paragraph, and then, slowly, he smiled. A week later, Jake stood in a community center classroom in East Boston. The air smelled like old paint and cafeteria pizza. In front of him sat 20 teenagers, some from shelters, others from juvenile programs, all carrying invisible weights. Jake wore jeans and a clean button-up. Bear sat calmly at his side, wearing a patched vest that now read, Community Mentor. He didn't start with a speech. I'm not here to tell you how to live, he said. I'm just here to tell you how I survived. The room was still, curious, guarded. He told them about the bench behind the train yard, about the morning Bear found him, about hunger, about being invisible. And then he told them what happened when someone finally looked. Most people waited for me to be cleaned up before they listened, he said. But the ones who mattered, they listened when I still had dirt on my face. A boy in the back raised his hand. You still afraid? Jake nodded. Sometimes, but now I know what I'm afraid of losing. That's how I know I've got something worth holding on to. After that, the invitations kept coming. Youth programs, libraries, podcasts. A local college offered him an honorary position as a community fellow, asking if he'd speak to first-year students about resilience and reform. He accepted, but he made one thing clear to every organizer. I'm not a hero. I'm just proof that someone doesn't have to stay broken. He still spent his mornings at the Quincy yard with Trevor, working with young men who were learning to rebuild old railcars, and in many cases rebuild themselves. Jake never barked orders. He asked questions instead, listened when they were angry, held silence when they were ashamed, taught them how to listen to machines and to themselves. They called him Coach. Bear, of course, became everyone's emotional support. He'd curl up in the break room or rest his head on a trainee's lap during lunch. Sometimes Jake caught the guys talking to him like an old friend, and maybe that's what Bear was, to all of them. Late nights were reserved for writing. The memoir grew steadily, each chapter raw and unpolished, but real. The publisher loved it. The title came easily, Unseen Until Now. An excerpt ran in the Boston Globe and went viral online. Thousands of readers wrote in, people who had been homeless, or who had lost someone, or who just needed to believe people could change. Jake read every email. Some made him cry, others made him laugh, but all of them made him feel what he hadn't felt in years, connected. One afternoon, while walking bare near the river, Jake was approached by a woman in her 50s. She looked hesitant. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Jake Ralston?" He nodded. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn, laminated photo. "This was my brother," she said softly. "He was on the street for a long time. We lost him in 2012. No one ever really looked." Jake stared at the photo. The man's eyes looked like his once had, numb, cloudy, forgotten. The woman touched Jake's arm. "Thank you for making people look." The book launch was quiet, just as Jake had wanted. No TV cameras, no glitzy signings, just a table at the local library, a stack of paperbacks and a hand-painted sign. Sometimes, survival is the first sentence. People came, not for autographs, but for conversations. Stories were exchanged, tears were shed, hugs were given. And when the evening wound down and Bear laid his head on Jake's foot like always, Jake realized something. He had become the thing he never thought he could be. A voice. The city hadn't transformed overnight. The shelters were still full, the streets still held cold wind and colder shoulders, but something was different. People paused more often. They made eye contact more. Sometimes someone even sat beside a person on a bench instead of walking by. Jake kept doing his part, quietly, steadily, and through every step Bear stayed by his side. Because sometimes the story we share doesn't change the world in a flash. Sometimes it changes just enough to help someone else begin theirs.